Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our event on housing security during COVID-19 and beyond. My name is Ida Rademacher, and I lead the financial security program at the Aspen Institute. And I know we're going to have a great conversation today. Please join us online, either on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And if and when you do, use the hashtag AspenFSP Live. And we'll look forward to engaging with you there and in the days and weeks to come on this topic. This event and the work behind it has literally been years in the making. The Aspen EPIC team at the Financial Security Program began our work on housing in late 2018. And today we'll share with you some of what we've learned about solving housing problems that undermine millions of Americans' financial security. And that problem has only been exacerbated and accelerated during COVID. I'm grateful to our funders and our partners for making this work possible, specifically for the work on housing and this report. Thank you to the MetLife Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Prudential Foundation for the ways that they have really encouraged us to move forward with this work in ambitious ways. For those of you unfamiliar with the EPIC process at FSP, it's a first of its kind program and process that investigates the dimensions and drivers of the most critical financial challenges facing American families, and also helps diverse group of leaders implement solutions that solve those challenges sustainably and at scale. We took on the problem of housing insecurity because about 100 million people were living in housing that was unstable, unsafe, and unaffordable even prior to the pandemic, a situation that was increasingly unsustainable. We diagnosed the underlying drivers of the problems and identified a set of solutions that address that problem head on. And I think you'll see in both the primer research and in the solutions framework that we don't pull our punches, and we let the evidence really lead us to solutions that we need to lift up and lead on. The report is organized into sections for different audiences, everyone from policymakers at all levels of government to investors, to developers and landlords. No matter who you are, there is something in here for you. And that includes a variety of potential solutions, as well as a set of broad, universally applicable design principles that can guide your efforts to adapt those solutions to work best in your communities. In the middle of the project, COVID-19 poured gasoline on several long simmering fires. Suddenly, the country was facing an unprecedented wave of evictions, and we put EPIC's research to impact mission into action to help address the immediate crisis. We worked with our partners at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project to quickly produce one of the earliest estimates of the magnitude of the problem of evictions, finding that 30 to 40 million renters were at risk by the end of 2020. And sometimes the right data at the right time really can change lives. That statistic of 30 to 40 million renters made its way into the media, and ultimately it's been used in over 1,800 news stories. We heard from local policymakers from rural and urban areas, from state legislators from across the country, and from members of Congress. And all of them have been asking how to respond to this major problem. And crucially, our work was cited by the Centers for Disease Control in its eviction moratorium. The CDC determined that housing displacement at the scale that we were estimating would increase the public health threat posed by COVID-19. And new research demonstrates that the eviction moratorium prevented thousands of unnecessary deaths from COVID-19. So we love that our work has created impact even before we released the solutions framework last week. One of the key lessons, of course, from the pandemic is that public policy must be central to addressing both the acute pandemic-related housing problems and the longer-term issues. And as I mentioned, housing affordability as an issue was picking up steam well before the pandemic in 2018. It continued to gain visibility and leaders leaning into the issue during the presidential campaigns. And the focus, although it's narrowed in 2020 to preventing evictions and foreclosures in the midst of the recession and COVID, really will continue to be at the center of many resilience and recovery plans. We see the $25 billion in rental assistance included in the most recent economic relief package as a down payment on future efforts that ensure people's housing is a source of stability and access to opportunity and economic dignity, and paves the way for long-term financial security. Looking into the future after the pandemic, we aim to translate many of those solutions included in this report into impact that meaningfully improves millions of people's financial security. Tim Shaw, who is our Associate Director for Policy, will be coming on toward the end of the session today to talk more about the work that we'll be doing, developing tools for local leaders. And so we look forward to that. Please stick around for the entire conversation. Tim will have more to say on that after our fantastic panelists. And I want to thank each and every one of them for joining us. Such expertise implementing housing solutions in different communities and from different sectors. And that's going to be so great to hear about. I'll be listening in, I'll be participating online, but for now I want to thank you again for joining us, and I want to turn it over to my colleague, Catherine Lucas Mckay, who is Senior Program Manager, who's done the lion's share of the work to put forth the solution framework that hopefully you have online as well. Thanks again for joining us.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for the technical difficulties. I think we're going to do a quick change of our agenda today while we sort out those audio issues on our end. So we're going to move to doing the panel first and turn our agenda around a little bit. So we'll put that presentation by Catherine at the end, and she'll go over the solutions framework and the key points from that we came out with last week and should be in all of your inboxes. But right now, I'm excited to introduce the killer panel that we have coming up for to highlight the work of local leaders in addressing the housing crisis. As Catherine will be talking about in her segment of the event, a lot of our solutions work and our solutions framework is focused on the idea that the housing crisis of affordability, instability, and equity have solutions that span leaders from across sectors and at all levels. And these folks that we have on this panel today are living examples of that. We have folks from across the country, folks with national perspectives, from government, from private sector, from nonprofits, and each of those sectors we know has a key role to play in housing. There are also folks who I think have exemplified what it means to make housing a national issue at this time of crisis. As Ida mentioned earlier, we know from our research that millions and millions of folks face the prospect of eviction in the middle of a pandemic. But also, when the pandemic is over and when we finally reach some semblance of normalcy again, a lot of these housing challenges will continue. Many people live in chronically unaffordable housing. Many live in unstable housing. And in addition, the vestiges of racial injustice continue to harm communities of color in their ability to achieve financial security and build long-term wealth relative to other people in America. And these folks have focused on these challenges and will give a broad range of perspectives on how we can deal with this now, directly during the pandemic, but also into the future. And so I'm very excited to have them. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panel. We have Mayor Andy Burke, the Mayor of Chattanooga, Lucy Arellano Baglieri, the Chief Strategy Officer of the Low Income Investment Fund, Daryl Shore, the Vice President of Inclusive Solutions at Prudential Financial, and our panel will be moderated by Jerusalem Demsis, a Politics and Policy Fellow and reporter at Vox.com. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you for bearing with us as we transition and move the agenda around a little bit.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to be here with a really great panel. We're ready to dive right in. So first things first, I think what's on everyone's mind here is Congress has recently passed legislation that includes both the extension of an eviction moratorium through the end of January, as well as $25 billion in rental assistance. The Aspen Institute's report today it estimates that renters owed about $7.2 billion by the end of last year, but estimates range up to about $100 billion, which came from Moody's Analytics' Mark Zandi. So it's unclear how much people owe, but it is quite a substantial sum. So first things first is, how will these federal interventions address the scope of the housing insecurity problem where you are? And if we can start with Mayor Burke, that would be great.
Sure, thanks, Jerusalem, and honored to be here with y'all today. So first, a little bit about Chattanooga. So Chattanooga's a mid-sized city. We're a city of about 180,000 in a county of roughly 375,000 and a metro of 575,000, and we're square in the middle. We've seen unprecedented economic growth over the last few years, and at the beginning of coronavirus, Forbes said we'd be the #1 city in the country for new jobs. Didn't quite work out that way, unfortunately for us, but we've had a rental crisis that's been going on because rents have been rising, and although we've had one of the highest wage growths in the country, we haven't been able to keep up with what we've seen in our rental growth. So even before this was going on, every year the federal government had been seeing our CDBG dollars decline, and we had gone down to about $1.6 million a year. And just since the CARES Act, that pumped more, the two different infusions that we've got is more than 2 million. So just to give you an idea, we basically have seen more than a doubling of the amount that we have, and that's great. On the other hand, there are lots of restrictions that come with those dollars. So we can't use it to help people who are in public housing. We can't use it to help people who are, Section 8 renters. We can't help people who need more than 3 months worth of rent. And so there are still lots of reasons that the city is putting its own dollars, including money from an affordable housing fund. So I think what we can say is, yes, there are positives, and obviously it's been fantastic to see those additional dollars, but there is still a substantial gap, both because of the amount and then also because of the restrictions that we see between what we are getting and what we need. And on top of that, we know that coronavirus has had such a disparate impact on people at the lowest end of the economic spectrum, our service workers, the people who get paid hourly, and that's exacerbating the crisis and will continue to over the course of 2021.
And Daryl, you're in Newark right now, so can you talk a little about the local context there and how these federal dollars have played out in your area?
Sure, thank you. So I think many people know that Prudential, we are headquartered in Newark, and we've been there 150 plus years, and have really been committed to the city and really helping the city thrive and address challenges that the city has faced over time. Newark is a city where 78% of the population are renters. And so as you can imagine, the impact that the virus has had on renters and their ability to really make and stay ahead of their rent has been drastic. And so, the mayor put out 2 rounds of funding to really support rental assistance. The first one was $1 million, the second was $2 million. But the reality is the need is a lot greater than the funds that are available at the city level. And quite honestly, even with the federal money, that's really more of a triage mindset. How do we kind of really address the crisis right now? But I think long-term, we have to think about what are the systemic things that we have to think about long-term, because we know that housing insecurity, particularly in Newark, existed well before the pandemic, and the pandemic only really amplified it. And so I think what we're really thinking about with the additional money is we're going to continue to really see how you can help the current residents, who many of them may have been out of work 9+ months the whole time of the pandemic. As Mayor Andy referenced, a lot of the residents in Newark are at the lower end of the income spectrum. And so, just from a financial wellness perspective, they've been impacted. From a knowledge perspective, a lot of them have seen eviction notices, rental fees added on to back rent. And so really thinking about it very comprehensively. I think the mayor has been very successful in the 2 rounds of funding. I think that's been very helpful. I think the office of tenant, where people can go and get the knowledge they need around evictions where they shouldn't receive. I think the federal funding will help and continue to provide some additional resources. But again, I think the bigger point is, where do we think about this on a more systematic level and think about it from a long-term perspective? So when we get from this moment in time, we really have to think about, how do we continue to make sure that we provide resources to residents? So that's been the approach that that's happened in the city of Newark.
Thank you, Daryl. And Lucy, you're kind of in the epicenter of the housing crisis in the Bay Area long before this crisis, but it's been exacerbated, especially in California. So can you speak a little bit about, again, how the federal government's aid has helped in your state and your area, but also, I know California's done a lot on its own to try to aid this, and how has that played into where we are today?
Sure, thank you. And thank you to the Aspen Institute for inviting me to be part of this really important conversation. And thank you to all of the attendees, not only for joining, but all the work that you're doing out in communities every day. I'm based in San Francisco, and with Lyft, though, we have a national reach. So you'll hear me kind of toggling back and forth between local and national. I'll just really kind of echo what both Mayor Burke and Daryl have shared around gaps. So in terms of the question about how will this aid support, I would say partially. And how, what do we need is exactly what Daryl said, is a more comprehensive and a more holistic approach to this. In terms of the topic at hand around rental assistance, that's one piece of the puzzle, right? The way that it's structured currently many times is on a 1-by-1 basis. So one person at a time, one family at a time, one payment at a time. And we know that that's just not the way that things work. Currently, the moratorium is extended through the end of this month, which gives us time to go into a new administration, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it gives people time to catch up even with one payment. So there's a timing issue, very simply. Also, the challenges that we've seen that we'll talk more about today are not going to end when the eviction moratorium ends, right? Housing, I argue, is obviously, I think we all agree, is very foundational to everything else in our lives. I like to say all roads lead back to housing, but housing doesn't operate on its own. You can't just solve for housing, even if you can solve for housing and kind of fix everything else. So when we think about the deep inequities that, again, existed before the pandemic, but that really have been compounded during the pandemic, we need to think about the workforce. Mayor Burke talked about the lower wage earners, the essential workers that are not often thought of as essential workers, mostly people of color who have to go out, cannot work at home. And businesses, there are decades old businesses that have closed forever. You don't bounce back from that in less than a month. And so what we really need to see is more of a holistic approach to addressing those other needs, to have ongoing support, and that really targets those that have been the most deeply impacted, which again, we have seen that to be people of color. Women in this recession have been really deeply impacted. The figures show more than men across the board. And we also need to address kind of the food chain, so to speak, or the housing continuum, right? We can think about the renters themselves, but we also need to think about the landlords, and the landlords have to obviously pay to lenders. The one last thing I'll say here is that we also should think about homeownership and preservation of homeownership. Homeownership is one of the key ways that particularly people of color can build wealth. And we see each recession, any gains that we make in wealth building gets wiped right out with each recession. And so we have an opportunity to be a little bit more forward thinking and more comprehensive around preserving those gains to kind of bridge us past this recession as well.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing it back to, this is a long running problem. This is not something that was invented by the COVID-19 pandemic. All three of you spoke well to that. And I mean, it's impossible to talk about housing insecurity without talking about how much demand has really outpaced supply. And, that's a big part of the report that has been released by the Aspen Institute today. And so, I mean, there are onerous zoning regulations that have been talked about ad nauseum by folks at the local level that restrict for the ability for the market to solve for some of this. But however, it's just never ever going to be profitable for developers to solve for all low income housing. Some of this stuff is just not profitable in every location. So folks have been turning to local and state governments to intervene and to ensure that housing is accessible to lower income folks, and to make sure that it's built and maintained, especially because we saw at the end of 2008, after the end of the 2008 financial crisis, that a lot of small landlords were unable to hold on to the affordable housing stock that America still had. So if folks could speak more to dealing with this dynamic, having to solve for something that's like the market's never going to solve for, and ensuring that you have lower income housing available to folks, that would be great. So Daryl, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you. I think you raise a great point, and I think how we in Newark, Prudential, working with many partners, we've thought about it in a couple of ways. So Newark is a city where there is a significant amount of housing stock. The problem is the quality of that stock. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we use private and public funds to improve the quality of the affordable housing in the city. And I always say it's not housing for the sake of housing, but it's really making sure that housing is the foundation. But I think to Lucy's point, it's really about what's the comprehensive approach. If house is disconnected from resources, a grocer, jobs, transportation, 50% of Newark residents do not own a car, so they're dependent on mass transportation. So it's really thinking about your affordable housing more comprehensively, understanding that housing disconnected really does not help the residents that we want to help. And so we really have to think about it in a comprehensive approach. I think Prudential, we've done a lot of work working with the city, working with other partners to increase the amount of affordable housing in the city. Over the years, we've added well over 1,000 residential units downtown, but I could say that every development that we finance out of our impact investment unit, there is an affordable housing component to it. So what that tells you is you can do it. It may not be the easiest way. And of course, the capital stack looks very, very complex. And of course, you're dependent on that local and state and federal funding, but it is doable. And I think if you have that North Star that you're going to add units, but you're going to make sure that those units are inclusive and that those units provide affordability where it can, I think you can do it. It's not easy. And then secondly, I think a lot of the housing in Newark is in the neighborhoods. And so it goes back to earlier points that Lucy talked about, is that yes, housing is the foundation, but we also think about it more comprehensively. What are the small businesses serving the residents in that neighborhood? How do we invest in community development, financial institutions that are really the anchors in our neighborhoods in Newark? So Prudential, we talk about being an anchor institution in the city. But when you think about the different neighborhoods, we know that CDCs play that anchor role, and so it's important to build their capacity. And I think it's another important thing that we've thought about is we started to look at home ownership. So I mentioned earlier, 78% of Newark residents are renters. So as we think about how do we help the residents build wealth, improve their economic mobility, we know that home ownership has a role in that, but we need to understand what the barriers are that have prevented a mostly minority city from its residents being able to achieve that home ownership. And so we've supported research to come in and really, one, identify those barriers, but then help us think about policy solutions that are really out of the box, that are really understanding that there is a racial inequality here. And so you have to have a racial equity lens to build policies to create home ownership in the city as well. And then I think it's, again, finally, I'll say it's that comprehensive approach. Another fact is that 80% of the jobs in Newark are held by people like myself, people who do not live in the city. So what are we doing to build and improve the workforce system so that Newark residents can start to connect to the jobs in their city? Because the reality is we can't think about a home ownership strategy if we don't really think about the total well-being of the residents, whether it's education, whether it's financial, and even public safety, wanting people to be able to want to live in the neighborhoods in Newark and feel that they can walk from their home to their child's school. So we've really taken a very comprehensive approach about it, understanding that housing is a foundation, but you just can't have housing without thinking about the other amenities and resources.
Exactly. And Lucy, if you can speak a little bit more towards the ability for local governments to actually create and incentivize the creation of very low income housing and making sure that we're keeping the affordable housing stock stable, especially in a place like California where that's become an extremely hot button political issue. I'm sure folks would like to hear about that.
Sure. And I really like what you said about not being able to expect that the market can solve for this, right? You noted that currently there's a profitability challenge for developers, even nonprofit, very mission-driven developers, to be able to make the numbers work, so to speak. And that's really what we're trying to do at LIF. It's interesting, I'll offer that we're looking at usually when we think about the supply challenge, we think about production as a way to solve for that. And we've really been thinking about preservation as a way to solve for that. Some of you know that we have a new partnership that we formalized at the end of last year with National Affordable Housing Trust, NAHT, and SAFE, Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future, which is a network of some of the largest affordable housing developers in the country. And we're very much focused on both production, but what I would like to kind of offer some remarks around preservation. So when we think about how the challenge of the supply shortage of affordable housing, which I think is really important to differentiate, because particularly in certain geographies, there is not a widespread housing shortage. There is a shortage of affordable housing. And so, definitely here in the Bay Area, even if you think about, the tens of thousands of vacant units that sit around, that they are not, affordable housing or accessible to day-to-day families or individuals. But when we think about that, the problem is only going to get worse if we don't do something about it. We know that production costs and materials are getting much more expensive day by day. There are a lot of other reasons that we won't go into as to why politically, but what we're really trying to do is think about how to bring in public resources and even philanthropic resources to bridge those kind of gaps in the financing to be able to make the numbers work. There's an estimate that over the next decade, there are about 500,000 affordable homes which are going to actually move out of affordability due to the affordability expiring. So when we think about how crunched we already are, it's also important, again, to think ahead about what's to come. We saw post the last recession, private equity kind of swept in and in a very predatory way, took a lot of units off of the affordability grid. And so we have an opportunity to have a nonprofit, a public-private, nonprofit wall of defense to preserve not only the existing affordable housing stock that we have, but also to proactively preserve those that are at risk coming up in the future years.
And Mayor Burke, I'm going to pivot a little bit over to you. Obviously, preservation is a really important part of this, and production as well, especially as we talked briefly earlier about how there are design principles that the Aspen Institute has put out as part of their report. Two of those, the first two are to affirmatively address racial and ethnic inequality and other forms of discrimination. And the second is to make it easier to build all types of housing. You and local government obviously have to work with different stakeholders across your city and across the state of Tennessee to ensure that you're bringing people to the table. But frequently, when you bring folks to the table, you can also create ways for small groups of people to become roadblocks to any kind of progress or any kind of change. And frequently that disadvantages lower income folks and people of color who are not as often a part of these groups or not able to access these spaces. So how have you worked to kind of design a process in which you're able to get development through, you're able to create economic growth in your area, but you are also able to hear the legitimate concerns of folks who may be concerned about the ways in which the development is happening and to make sure that their voices are being heard as part of that process?
Well, first of all, that's really difficult, and nobody should underestimate just how hard that is. And what I would do is, let me start with the project that we're currently working on. And part of what I was going to say in response to the previous question, for example, is we use policies, we use financial incentives, and then we use our own property. So we have a piece of property that's on our main street. One of the things that is most difficult for Chattanooga is that we're a place where our affordable housing is a spatial mismatch to where the jobs are. So the affordable housing is out there. It may be low quality, and it's also not near access to jobs. And we're a place that doesn't have high quality mass transit that's available to lots of people. And so the farther we put out people, we may find them some affordable housing out there, but then the possibility of them earning more money goes down as we do that. We have to really be careful about that. And then the wealthier the neighborhood is, the more that they say, don't put that housing near us, put it over there, which again pushes all the housing into different areas. So our property that's on Main Street, one of the things that we've done is to say, let's use our property for affordable housing, our property being owned by the city. We had a large piece of property there. And obviously Main Street, you can tell it's near where jobs are. And we wanted to use that for supportive housing for people who were housing insecure, where they would have mental health services available to them. And a number of the residents of the local neighborhood didn't want that. So, I think the proper thing is, first of all, you have to make sure people are heard. You can't dismiss their concerns. And the second is that you really have to organize people to speak out on behalf of what's happening and to make sure that there are advocates there, because it's very easy for the loud people who don't want to see that to win. And fortunately, it was not an easy process, for example, but continuing to have neighborhood meetings, continuing to give people information, and also empowering those who wanted to speak up on behalf of affordable housing was great. Let me just make one final point. That's really tough to scale. That is really tough to scale. All these issues that we're talking about, money, policies, and community involvement, it is tough to scale that. We've preserved or built over 2,000 units over the last few years that are low and moderate income, and it's still not nearly enough. And so at some point, you have to have large scale policy solutions that are going to set the defaults in the right place and make sure that the federal government is putting the proper money in, that the state has the right policies, and so on, so that you can get the amount that you actually need to help this problem.
Great. And well, we have 5 minutes remaining, so I'm just going to do a quick round robin for folks here about, what exactly we're going to need from the federal government and what we're going to need from state governments and local governments to do after COVID-19 is something we'll hopefully be able to tackle this year and get folks vaccinated. What are we going to need to do? What are the major 1 or 2 things that you're going to need to ensure that we don't have, massive evictions and a larger homelessness problem than we already do in some areas, as well as ensuring that, we're seeing a K-shaped recovery right now. And that's great that some folks are able to weather the storm through remote work and to not have that kind of economic turmoil in their sector. But that also means that a lot of more privileged folks are very insulated from what's going on in lower income and predominantly minority communities. So if y'all could speak to those challenges and what you think are the most pressing policy implementations that need to happen in the next year or two. We'll start with you, Lucy.
Sure, thanks. I think first and foremost, and this is pretty broad, when we're thinking about all of these challenges and inequities that are really compounded most deeply for people of color and low-income people, I think we really need to work hard to, both in the short term and the long term, think about how we actually become more decision makers at scale, how we switch the paradigm from us constantly being the stakeholders to be consulted, but rather actually, being elected into decision-making roles and being really at the front of developing, I would say, sharing the solutions, because I think our communities have already developed what we need and what we want. And I think that we also really need to immediately take a close look at a lot of so much of the policy damage that has been done over the last 4 years, and thinking about the reopening window of opportunity for reversing some really detrimental, both legislative and regulatory policies. For example, we have seen some really damaging rules coming out of HUD, removing benefits for mixed status families, so regarding their immigration status, thinking about the affirmative furthering fair housing laws. We've seen that regressed and done away with. We need to immediately kind of make up for and reverse a lot of the damage that has been done. And then looking ahead, again, really thinking about what are some policies that invest very, very deeply in communities of color, low-income communities, and that are not race neutral, because our life is not race neutral, the inequities have not been race neutral. And so how do we have more of a targeted and explicit advocacy around that, I think is going to be key.
Yeah, it looks like the Biden HUD is likely to reverse the Trump administration's work on the AFFH. And also they look to be considering potentially automatic stabilizers so that rental, in the future, any kind of harms to renters are automatically dealt with. We allow it to go through the economy. So Daryl, if you could give a couple of quick things that you think you need from the federal government or from local governments, that would be great.
Sure. I think I'm going to echo a lot of what Lucy said. I think we need leadership. I think as we think about Newark, Mayor Baraka has put inclusion and racial equity at the forefront. That's his North Star. That's driving all policies. That's recognizing our history and understanding that, these barriers, systemic barriers that have put in place for a lot of people of color, whether it's around housing, job opportunity, education, really need systemic solutions, but systemic solutions that are not race neutral. We understand that the barriers that presented or put in place were not race neutral. So to break them, you cannot have a race neutral approach. I think we need to continue to give agency to the community. And what I mean is how do we support the grassroots? I think a lot of us would say that the last election at the federal level and even at some state level turned out the way they did because local level people took agency, took ownership of their community, took ownership of their vote, even given the barriers they faced to make a change. And so how do we continue to empower at the local level and support those organizations? Again, whether it's around housing, education, or all the other social ills that we think about. And then finally, I think it's to continue to have intentionality. And so as we develop programs that provide financial resources or federal resources, state resources or local resources, there needs to be intentionality. These resources are being directed to improve affordable housing, but again, not taking a race neutral approach and understanding that the inequalities that exist today did not have a race neutral approach. And so we have to have that same intentionality as we try to address them, even with our federal, state, and local funds to kind of address those issues.
Thanks, Daryl. And Mayor Burke, you can have the final word here. You're in government right now, so you can let us know what will be the most helpful for you.
All right, and thanks again to y'all. Pleasure being on a panel with you, and thanks to Tim and Aspen Institute. Hey, listen, when we're asking about what can the federal government do, let's never underestimate money. Like there is a portion of this problem that is financially related because the developments don't pencil out without subsidies. And I spent a lot of time with people talking about this, so never underestimate the value of money when it comes to this problem. I would put that as at least one piece. And the second piece I would just say, and we've all pointed to that, is this is really a problem about how do we give more people access to opportunity? How do we make sure that they are able to gain more power and have control over their lives? And that means that the issues have to do with how much money do you make? If you make enough money, then you don't have to. Affordable housing is not nearly as much of a solution. It's about transportation and being able to get to opportunity. And so I know I've been around long enough to have worked with the Obama administration when they were trying to pull a bunch of these solutions together, but making sure that we are setting policies that leverage all of our different levers with the idea that people need more opportunity to live the life that they want. If we can start to do that, put the money in place that is necessary, work on some of the policies that Lucy and Daryl were talking about, we can actually help people in our community. And that's the opportunity that we really have right now.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Lucy. And now we have Catherine Mckay, who is the Senior Program Manager at the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program. And she's going to be able to do the presentation on the new report that was supposed to happen at the very beginning. So thank you to all the panelists. Really excited to be here. And we're just going to turn off our microphones and turn it over to Catherine.
My name is Catherine Lucas Mckay. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the EPIC initiative at Aspen FSP. And that means that I have been leading our work on housing since 2018, and also that I am really excited to share what we've learned so that you can hear more about how this actually happens on the ground in local communities. I'm going to share my screen and get started on a presentation that'll go about 15 minutes. So here we are, January 2021. We began in 2018. What we do, what you'll hear about over the next 15 minutes is what we do, which is connecting one consequential issue to people's financial security, researching it in depth for several years, diagnosing the underlying problems that lead that issue to be a source of financial insecurity, and then develop a menu of solutions that people who are key stakeholders in every involved sector can use to help advance solutions. Of course, there's COVID-19 in the middle of that, because this was not an ordinary time to be working on housing security. This was, in fact, a historic moment for housing insecurity. Why housing? It's really simple. Housing is the necessary foundation of financial security. It's almost every family's largest expense, and the only way that people can have the basics that they need to thrive is to start with stable housing. We also know that solving for housing security improves people's lives. We did a survey last fall with SaverLife of 499 of their members, asking a variety of questions about their housing security and insecurity experiences, and ending with an open-ended question: how would your life change if your housing challenges were solved? Every single one of the most common responses listed here: less stress, more savings, better housing, more job security, getting a better job, buying a house and building wealth. All of those connect directly to financial security and would help people build that, as well as making their housing a better situation for them. And then finally, this is not just an isolated problem. People's housing security affects everyone, and everyone benefits when families have stable housing that they can afford. That includes education systems where students who are experiencing instability really struggle and often don't graduate. It includes healthcare systems that have large unreimbursed costs when they help people who've lost their housing, and who also have to treat chronic illnesses that result from unhealthy housing, like asthma. Government benefits, fairly obviously, spending less, bringing in more tax revenue, and businesses as well, particularly employers. So I've mentioned this is a multi-year project. Just quickly to make sure that you know how much of our homework we really have done. These are the inputs that went into it. Both the first year of deep research, putting together our research primer, and then also this year, doing a solution scan, running additional surveys, the SaverLife survey that I mentioned. And as we tallied up everything several months back, we realized, wow, we engaged with over 100 individual people during this process through an interview or a roundtable event. And these folks come from every sector, every different type of perspective on housing. And this really helps us develop a point of view that is integrated, that takes into account all of the different ways of looking at the problem and looking at solutions. And we really believe that that makes our work stronger. So the housing primer, if you have not read that nearly 100-page report, I encourage you to. It's great, but also it can be boiled down more or less to this slide. The housing crisis that started building in the early 2000s has 4 core underlying drivers. First, there is not enough new housing to meet growing demand. Second, many families can't afford the housing options available to them. That's not just low-income and moderate-income families, but in many places, also middle-class households. Discrimination continues to harm people of color. Other groups experience discrimination as well, particularly disabled folks and LGBTQ communities, but the legacy, the history, and the impact on Black and Brown communities throughout the United States cannot be understated, and it is a current day problem too. And then finally, current policy disadvantages renters. So we published this problem diagnosis in January 2020, just about 51 weeks ago. And right after that, the US went into lockdown. We had just started work on the Housing Security Solutions Framework that we have released today. And what we did immediately was kind of pause, take a step back, start observing, make sure that we had a sense of what was really happening with people's housing security, whether it was the same, different drivers than what we had already seen. And where we came to was that those 4 core drivers laid the groundwork for this. We had a slow build crisis. We had a crisis that affected about 100 million Americans living in housing that they couldn't afford based on their income. Now we're talking about much greater levels of risk than just struggling to pay for your rent or mortgage. Now we're talking about 30 to 40 million renters at risk of eviction. As of the end of the year, 8% of mortgage loans are delinquent. Now, the Great Recession peak was 10%. That we're getting close to what had been an almost unimaginable record for the second time in a decade. And then we know that the number of people experiencing homelessness is rising in a number of major cities. I want to dig in a little bit on that eviction estimate. Many of you have heard that 30 to 40 million Americans are at risk right now as of the end of 2020. Aspen FSP produced this estimate with our partners at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, and using data from April, June, and November, have tracked the number of renters at risk of eviction over several months. At this point, about 1 in 5 renter households are behind on their rent. That's huge. And just like we saw before COVID, looking at housing insecurity, the same groups are at the highest levels of risk. It's Black renter households, Latinx renter households, and those with kids who are facing the highest level of challenge right now. I also want to point out each one of these states here represented in red, more than 30% of their renter households are at risk right now. This is a crisis, and it's a crisis that we cannot afford to ignore. Thankfully, one of the things that makes it a crisis that we know how to solve is that we know what works in eviction prevention. We know what works in rapidly rehousing people who do unfortunately lose their housing. And we know what works in terms of helping people in court. What we need to do is connect the immediate absolute crisis need and the solutions there to the medium-term and long-term solutions that are needed to address those same underlying drivers of these problems. Now, before 2020, not every one of these stakeholders listed on this slide may have thought of themselves as COVID-19 crisis housing stakeholders, but everyone is. We all stand to lose if people experience long-term housing insecurities stemming from a pandemic that, while much longer than we had hoped, is still a short-term phenomenon in the larger span of people's lives. So the full report has explicit, well-organized, specific ideas for a wide variety of stakeholders. And if you are seeing yourself in this list here, there is something for you in the report, and we really encourage you to dive into the full version. It was a challenge to determine what solutions went into the framework, given how much there is out there. So we established a couple of criteria. First, even to be considered, solutions needed to be scalable, effective in multiple types of markets, not just one particular, and either backed by empirical evidence of their effectiveness, or they're innovative, have the potential to scale, and, you know, in our view, deserve an opportunity to prove their effectiveness. And then the second piece is effective is not enough. You also need to have solutions that are equitable and that are sustainable over time. So we developed a set of design principles that we recommend that people use as they determine what challenges to prioritize solving, and then what types of solutions are appropriate. I'm going to walk through each of these, but I want to also first say there is no solution out there that checks all 5 boxes. Again, it's prioritizing is key, and also, determining which of these design principles will do the most good in your community is a good way to start. Discrimination in housing, I've mentioned it. I've mentioned not just racial and ethnic, I've also mentioned other forms. There are a number of protected classes under the law, and most of them do not actually experience fair housing. That's critically important. One way that could be improved upon is a lot more money. If federal policymakers fully funded the cost of rigorous fair housing enforcement, in all likelihood, the situation would be better. And there are great guides and recommendations for them on how to do that. Second, make it easier to build all types of housing. We need the full spectrum. We don't need to necessarily pay as a public subsidy towards luxury high rises, but people want to live in them, and there's people who need housing. And that goes all the way from that to accessory dwelling units and manufactured homes. More than that, well, in addition to that, homes need to be located where people need them to be. It is true that there's a lot of vacant housing across the country, but it's not in the places where people need it. One example there is housing developers implementing universal design standards. That may not seem as intuitively obvious, but one of the things that we really seriously lack is housing that is accessible and that can help people who are disabled and those who are aging to stay in their homes. Third, preserve both subsidized and market rate affordable housing. That market rate often gets called NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing. It is important to do both because the vast majority of lower cost housing is not subsidized, and it is at risk because it is older. It is owned in general by small landlords who often are using it as a retirement income stream, and there is a lot of risk that those will be purchased and transitioned out of lower cost and instead become rehabilitated, expensive apartments. Fourth, support households directly. There's a big gap between what especially low-income households can pay and the cost of housing. The number one thing that needs to happen here is for rental assistance to become an entitlement for everyone who's eligible. Right now, it is a sad fraction of everyone who's eligible who actually gets any type of federal rental assistance. And then finally, support renters' well-being. They face very challenging circumstances when they have disputes with their landlords and when they can't pay their rent. And that's something you're seeing play out in spectacular fashion right now, but it's something that is also a long-running challenge. A big piece of the problem is the lack of eviction prevention programs and the lack of legal representation that people have when they're in landlord-tenant court. State policymakers have started pouring more money into those in the short term to match the current crisis. And we hope that that is something that gets ramped down as it is less needed, but not zeroed out. It's funding that really will play an important role in people's housing security in the future. Quickly, I want to just go over why we match certain solutions to different levels, federal, state, and local government. I'm going to focus on here. In the report, we also differentiate between national financial institutions and your friendly local community bank. The federal government has the money. It has the money and it has the regulatory power and the enforcement power. And it is the only institution with the power to do those things effectively. So we recommend that federal policymakers focus on those particular things, funding for the policies that are needed, and especially regulating and enforcing fair housing and anti-discrimination laws. I mentioned that the number one thing would be for Congress to provide federal housing assistance to everyone who is eligible. If one thing is all that can happen, this is the thing. It's not just the only thing. That said, there are so many. Local policymakers are the folks who make the decisions on the ground about which problems they are going to develop solutions to that reflect their local communities. They are most directly affected by the negative impacts because they are the folks who have to run those school systems. They are the folks who deal with the healthcare systems. They are the ones who are spending money that they don't have and losing tax revenues. So they have these strong incentives that make them great leaders on housing security solutions when they are committed. So some of the things that we've recommended for them really relate to the specifics of their communities, their land, their neighborhood, their neighborhoods, and things that are very much local and specific. So we also developed universal design principles that, we also developed a process for creating housing solutions on the ground. The first thing, the most critical thing, is building partnerships, especially with people who have lived experiences of housing insecurity. You need to have everyone's perspective in the process from the beginning of diagnosing the problems and identifying who is really suffering from those problems. And that requires working with people from the beginning who don't normally have their voices heard, along with all of the other stakeholders who need to be part of the process for it to succeed. Once you've done that diagnosis, identifying solutions that specifically match those problems is something that the solutions framework is really good for, but an important next step. And then prioritize among them. Which solutions are the right ones for your community, are the ones that you can actually make progress on, whatever it is that your set of criteria are. We recommend using those universal design principles and also tailoring an out-of-the-box policy really closely to your community needs. Out-of-the-box policies will not have the level of results that ideally you would want to see when you invest all of this time and energy from partnerships through actually advancing policies. That is the end of my presentation. Now I invite my colleague Tim Shaw to turn on his camera and unmute himself.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for all the hard work that you put on this. I want to thank our panelists and also you all who are in the audience. I'm going to keep it quick because we have just a few asks for you as we go into the next phase of work. I've looked at the list of who all is on this call, and as Lucy alluded to earlier, a lot of you all are doing the work on the ground of addressing housing challenges and the housing crisis facing people in America across the country, across the spectrum of sectors and types of leaders. And we want to thank you for that work and let you know that our next phase of work is to translate that large body of research that Catherine has done and that we're hearing from folks in our panel into tailored solutions for local leaders, and to continue to push the narrative that this needs to be a priority at the federal level. And that last point that I think Mayor Burke made that was really important, that needs support and monetary financial support if we're going to really get that done. And to help us do that, we have three asks for you. First, sign up for our newsletter. That's where you'll find those new resources that we pulled together, and you have the URL right here, bit.ly/FSP newsletter. Second, we have some of these resources and tools already available. In particular, at the end of last year, we partnered with the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, again, to put out a best practices of rental assistance resource, particularly for folks who might be getting access to $25 billion in federal aid that came in the last COVID package. It's really a great overview and a really specific resource for folks who might be working and implementing those programs right now. And so I urge you to check it out. Later in the year, part of our research work now is to develop a local housing solutions matchmaker tool. As was on display in our panel, there are a lot of solutions, but different solutions work in different communities that face different aspects of housing challenges. And we want to take all the data available to the folks who do research at the national level, like us, and give you a tool to tailor that and find particular solutions for yourself. So look out for that later this year. And finally, if you'd like to partner, my email is up on the screen. And a really critical thing that's a part of our theory of change is, as Lucy and others again on the panel said, local communities have been working on this for years and often know the solutions they need and that best fit their communities, and we're no different. We want to partner with you all who are doing the work on the ground to hear what's working for you and how to make sure that our work reflects local communities. And so we're open to those partnerships, and we want to hear from you. So thank you so much for joining us, bearing with us on our technical difficulties, and staying a little bit long. And I want to thank again the funders of Aspen FSP, the Prudential Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Prudential Foundation for their generous support in making this work possible. Thank you all so much for attending, for your work on the ground, and for joining us today. And take care.